Hey everybody, this is Jeff at Oli Builds, and today we're taking a look at the smaller of the two height-adjustable workbenches we built here at the shop. MFT stands for multi-function table, and the Micro Leveler part is the custom workbench beneath. We've built several of these now, and they work great as in-feed and out-feed tables, storage for tools and parts, as a giant layout table for the track saw, project mobility carts, and, of course, workbenches. We'll see how we took this Festool extension table and turned it into the workhorse of the shop. After completing the fabrication of the larger workbench and working out all the kinks, we turned our sights to the smaller extension table. It's about a 2/3 size table. It's a little shorter and a little thinner. The perforated top and the side rails are identical to the larger workbench. However, the 4 large corner brackets that support the legs for the large table are not included on the smaller table. On the larger workbench build, we used a series of plywood plates to connect the lower base to the upper table. And we have a full video that goes over all the steps of that construction process. And please remember to subscribe to the channel if you're interested in this fabrication and others like it. On the smaller workbench, we switched to an aluminum L channel. They're connected directly to the Festool aluminum rail you see here. The thinking behind the fabrication process of both workbenches was that we would not change the Festool itself or remove any parts, so that a user could take this off of the rolling workbench and still use it out in the field. Thankfully, there are these steel braces in the corner, and they already had several holes, so we're going to go ahead and take the original screw length that was in some of the brackets and just find a slightly longer screw. And we'll go ahead and drill right through that new aluminum L and go into the Festool bracket using these number 10 by 3/4 inch screws. They're essentially just the thickness of the new L bracket, longer than the original Festool screws. Wrapping up the connections to the non-leg side, and then we'll go ahead and check to see that everything still clears. And it looks like we're good to go. On the leg side, you'll see that there's this rotating arm with these 2 little flaps that come out to lock into place. If you were never going to use these legs again, you could take off the whole assembly by removing all 3 screws. But in our case, we're going to leave this little corner bracket on there that attaches the legs to the table. The deciding factor of whether to leave the legs on or off on top of the workbench is that if you leave them on and tucked underneath the table on top of the workbench, the legs themselves can block certain clamps from going through the workbench holes. As you can see, we have removed 4 original screws and we'll replace those with 4 longer screws. And we're just showing here, measuring out where the drill holes need to go. And the drilling is done, and we'll go ahead and put some screws in there. The workbench does rely on the shear strength of these 4 screws. We haven't had any problems in our workshop for the 1.5 years we've been using them. We'll just file that in the best judgment category, or medium duty uses. Legs folding back for a test fit. Next we'll show a preview of the hardware and how it attaches to the L bracket. There is limited room here on the aluminum angle to place the lifting mechanism, so we want to make sure that there's enough room to get to the dials to move the table up and down, but the bolts that go in the dial have to be far enough inside of the cabinet below to be able to move up and down. Once that's decided, we know what the dimensions for the cabinet box are going to be. And we're making a few marks on the aluminum as a reminder, and then we'll go ahead and make the box. Now that we have all the pieces for the cabinet box cut to length, we're going to go ahead and switch out the ripping blade for a dado stack. This setup works well for pieces of plywood that can fit on top of the table saw. For pieces that are too large or too cumbersome to run through the dado stack on the table saw, we'll go ahead and switch to the router method. We'll start here by setting the depth of the cut to 3/8 of an inch, which is approximately half of the width of the 3/4 inch plywood material we're using today. Setting up a sacrificial fence for the table saw. Going to run the piece of plywood right up next to the edge of the blade here. So this allows us to get the rabbet joint just perfect on the edge. I like to make the rabbet joint a bit long so that after you glue it up, you can go ahead and take that little extra bit off the end there. It's much more difficult to do it the other way around. It's easier to sand down a little nub on the end of the plywood than to sand down the whole face to match the joint. It can be cumbersome, if not dangerous, to run a piece of plywood through the dado stack on the table saw, if the plywood is longer across the table than the length of the fence is, it can tend to bind up on the blade. So it's good practice to switch to a method that's a little bit safer in many cases. This workbench is quite long and skinny, so we decided to put a diaphragm board to make 2 storage compartments. So we're just marking some lines here where the dado goes, putting on an edge clamp, and then we'll run the router right down the center of this. This will make a nice clean dado so that we can put the board in there and glue it up. We'll do the same thing on all 4 sides of the box, creating a dado channel all the way around. Since it's furniture for the shop, this is an optional step. You could easily just put these in with screws, but this way everything's just done in the one glue step. It's always crucial to do a dry fit assembly before you head into glue, because you don't want any of the joints to be too loose or too tight before you start getting glue and it gets messy and you start waving hammers around and swearing. The other benefit of having a diaphragm board in the middle that separated the 2 storage units is that the box could have a little instability, I suppose, if you were to use screws instead of glue joints. So if we add a diaphragm piece in the middle, it will be rock solid indefinitely. And we're switching back from the dado stack blades to a single blade to make some cuts. It's a good idea to hold off cutting the diaphragm board to the final length so that you know the depth of the dados and the rabbets for the box. And if there was any discrepancy there in your cuts versus the final dimensions, this gives you the opportunity to do the dry fit, and you can take the final dimensions down once you see precisely where the edges of the joints are. As mentioned before, we left the rabbet joints a little longer than the overall dimensions of the cabinet, so this allows us to get a flush cutting bit out on the router, and we'll go ahead and run that right along the edge here, and the roller bearing will make that nearly perfect. Little bit of residual glue. So we'll just break out the sander here and finish off the extra little bit that's on the edge, and it'll be perfect. Nice. Go ahead and touch up the lifting blocks with the sander as well while we've got it out. Okay, now that we've got that out of our system, this next step is adding some strength to the bottom of the aluminum L bracket. Since this is a workbench and there's going to be a lot of hammering and heavy things put on top of this, I figured that the bolts that attach to the lifting mechanism may over time warp the aluminum L bracket angle. So I just wanted to sandwich a 3/4 inch piece of plywood in between the L bracket and the bolts so that there was no chance of anything warping. It also provides a little bit more space for storing things underneath the tabletop when the table is in its lowest position. Drilling a hole through the plywood and the aluminum at the same time so that both bolts that will pass through both of the pieces will be an exact fit. Oh yeah, that's the good stuff right there. Here's a preview of the 3/8 by 16 all-thread bolt and a few washers and nylon nuts that'll be used in the lifting mechanism. Today's video is sponsored by Alien Pencil? Come on guys, let's get some better sponsors. Back to the video. Couple quick measurements to see where the edge of the box and the lifting mechanism are. Looks like we're 1 inch and 1 inch combined to 2 inches. I ended up transferring all the dimensions from the tabletop to the lower box. It would probably be a better idea to connect these plates to the tabletop and then just set it on top of this thing and drill through all the pieces at once. I took a big risk here that these things would actually line up when I put all the pieces together. Now kids, don't be like Uncle Jeff and take big risks. You're liable to make mistakes. Clamp everything together and make one drill hole, then everything will line up perfectly. You won't have to worry a bit. Now it's time to assemble all of the hardware. At the time of filming this video, we were just coming out of COVID, so some of these parts were a little hard to find. The black star-shaped through knob was in short supply, seemingly, since there was only one at all of the big box stores. So we continued here with just regular nuts. Here we're showing going back and doing what I should have done all along, and taking the tabletop off of the frame. I had it in my head that I just did not want to disassemble the Festool table. But as we approached the end, it became clear that had to be done to be able to get in and access these nuts on the very top. In order to keep all 4 of the lifting bolts the same length, there's a bit of fussing here to make sure that these nylon nuts are the same distance from the top of the bolt. 2 nylon nuts and 2 washers sandwich this plate at the very top. Thank you, Kennedy, for stepping in to help put the tabletop back on. The MDF top is secured to the aluminum rails of the MFT by this little steel gusset plate with a bolt. There are 2 different size Allen key bolts that attach to that little gusset plate, and they affix the tabletop to the aluminum rails. Alright, what is all that noise? Oh, Kennedy is making a cutting board, I see. Probably a cutout from one of our sink projects. Okay, back to business. We made the cabinet box below a little bit smaller than the workbench above. It's more comfortable to stand at a workbench without your knees banging up against the cabinet below you. Because the cabinet is rather thin and a little tall, we want to make sure that the thing doesn't topple over while we're moving it around the shop. So we've installed some skates below the box here, which act like outriggers stabilizing the unit. We've made them the same width as the tabletop above. That way 2 or more tables can be pushed up right against one another without the outriggers getting in the way, and the tabletops will be flush right against each other. Nothing fancy here, just a couple screws. We're using 8 by 1 5/8. And it's always a good idea to drill through the thinnest piece of material first and have the screw bite into the thicker chunk of material, in this case the stud below. Now we'll go ahead and get out the casters and screw those to the bottom of the 2x4 skates. Little pre-drill here and some wide flange screws. And now we basically have a working table that is ready for the shop. Here's a couple of items I wanted to point out. The design here was to make sure that no fingers would ever be crushed in the operation of this unit. The thickness of the star-shaped through knob provides a nice gap. Just like the original video where we show the larger workbench being made, these holes in the lower cabinet were drilled too small, and the table will not move up and down very smoothly. So this is the process of drilling a larger hole in a piece of scrap wood. You align that up with the smaller hole, just like so. And that will allow the larger bit to go through the smaller hole exactly in the same place. Now we've got our hands on 4 of these star through knobs. So we'll go ahead and reassemble everything here in its final configuration. Put the tabletop back on there. And come on, baby. Yes. Here's a close-up but out of focus view of the tabletop gusset plate and how it screws into the tabletop from below. We'll go ahead and tighten up all 4 corners here, and everything will be ready to go. In another video where we show the making of the larger workbench, I titled this sequence the anti-tilt nuts. And that was it. I failed to mention what was going on here. If you put one regular nut in this space below, it will prevent the table from tilting over if you clamp something to it and it cantilevers the table. To prevent scratching the lower leg plastic bracket here, just go ahead and file that corner off a little bit on the aluminum angle. Now that we're not using the old Festool plastic bracket to attach the 2 tables, we'll go ahead and take that off and stick it in a drawer and wonder what it is the rest of your life. Likewise, we can get rid of this obnoxious sticker that was on the tabletop, making things not perfectly smooth. Yeah, just rip that sucker right off there. One thing I noticed about using this as an outfeed table, the lower dust collection unit gets in the way. Pesky thing. Saving our lungs from dust. I suppose you could use larger casters and get up and over this thing, or maybe just don't put the table this close, but there it is. It's an issue. Since all the workbenches have the same size outrigger on the bottom for the caster wheels, you could take a 2x4 like this, span it across multiple workbenches and tie them together with some clamps. You could then roll 2 or more of them together as one unit. There is a lot of space on the side of these cabinets. You could put clamps or squares or any number of things. It's a great little tool wall. Hey, thanks for hanging out with us today. This is Jeff with Oli Builds, and sometimes Kennedy. We make custom cabinetry and furniture, and we love to make these projects in between. So please hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.